This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and today, just me, Sarah Raven. The reason is that I thought, as we've now been going for 3 years and had amazing millions of downloads, I just felt it was quite nice to welcome any new listeners and to describe a little bit about one of the pillars of the way I think and garden and one of the pillars of the Purpurea garden here. And that's about colour and what to do with it, really. So I'm somebody who really loves a full range of colour. But obviously, we don't want all our gardens and our vases and our pots to end up looking like countless rainbows all the way down the path, because that gets a little bit manic and busy and sort of quite joyful, but a bit tiring, if that's the right word. And actually having a little bit more calmness in the way that you combine colour really is easy on the eye and actually allows each tone of colours to really sort of glow and for you to see them, whether they're pales and sort of whites and off-whites or whether they're dark, rich, luxuriant colours. So I suppose over the years, I have evolved a system that I know really, really works. It definitely works for me, but I actually think it kind of works for everybody. And that is that I have divided the plant world, the flowering world really, because greens I think of almost like a background colour. Not some of them, not the noisier greens, but so I'm sort of excluding them. But the rest of flower colour I've divided into 4 palettes. And the first palette that is sort of my real heart palette, and the one that I started with is what I call the dark and rich. And just to give a little bit of background to that, I trained to be a medic, and during my mid to late 20s and early 30s, I was training to be a doctor. I trained at Charing Cross Hospital in London, but then I moved to East Sussex, to where we live now, and I was working at the Royal Sussex County in Brighton. But then I started to make a garden, and I also became pregnant with my second child, and so was on my second maternity episode in my life, or whatever you call it. My mat leave is now the modern phrase. And I started to make a garden here. And I worked so much in my first maternity leave doing friends and families' weddings and working mainly with white and blue and a little bit of primrose through the white, that almost in rebellion, I made this garden called the Oust Garden, devoted completely to very rich, luxurious colours. So crimsons, dark mahogany browns, rich cobalt blues, rich sort of amethyst purples, and then splashed through with some bright colours, a lot of acid green, a lot of silver, and a lot of orange. And that was really my first foray into really thinking about colour. And then, of course, there are famous people who've made amazing colour gardens, Vita Sattva-West being one of the most famous of them with her white garden at Sissinghurst. And I then was lucky enough to live with my husband, who is Adam Nicholson, who's Vita Sattva-West's grandson, at Sissinghurst for 8 years when we were bringing up the girls. And so was surrounded by the white garden, which is at its high point in June. And so kind of really got to see that in all lights over many seasons. And the purple border. And so again, even though it's called the purple border, it actually has magentas and crimsons and, tonally variations of purple. And then the cottage garden, which is Mexican sunset colours. So it's orange, yellow and red with sort of coppery bronze colours. So I spent sort of 8 to 10 years surrounded by gardens that were devoted to certain palettes. And that really got me thinking when I came back to doing more gardening here about other palettes that I wanted to use. And the one that I find most tricky is what I call the soft and cool, or I also call it the Champs-Élysées palette. And it's a sort of very crisp, chic, sort of Parisian person with very, very chic clothes, quite minimal, very, well, tidy, and kind of not at all like me, really. And it is true that I find that the most difficult to work with, but I absolutely love it. And so we had been excluding it from the garden here, including having very few white plants. But now I embrace it completely in the farmhouse garden, which leads out to the view. And that's how I think that palette works best. So when I wake up in the morning and look out of our bedroom window, we look out over the sort of white and pink and mauve patina and palette of tulips out to frosty fields with, luckily for us, a few fluffy sheep in them. But, whether it's dew or frost or even rain, when you look out into the countryside, we're in a very wooded part of the country, there's lots of lichen, and that palette just really smoothly and seamlessly merges off into the countryside. So for me, when you've got a garden very strongly in a view, that is the palette that works best. And so the whites mixed with the cool colours, so ending up with pale blue, pale mauve, pale pink, but of the cooler types, and pale primrose yellow, as well as white and silver. So those are 2 palettes. And then the third palette, which I've already mentioned actually, but I've separated out from the Oust Garden. And so I've got the dark and rich, and then through it, I scatter a little bit of what I call the boiled sweet. And boiled sweet is literally a packet of lime, lemon, strawberry, raspberry, orange, blackcurrant, etc. And if you add blue into it, it becomes stained glass. But none of us apparently want to eat blue sweets, so they're not in a boiled sweet packet. But if you want stained glass, then you always add blue, because, of course, it gives the most wonderful, radiant light. And the difference between those and the dark and rich is that the dark and rich are quite earthy, and they feel almost like they could have been mixed with a pigment mixed with soil, whereas the boiled sweet are similarly saturated, so lots of pigment, but they're lit from within. So they're not earthy, they're really luminous and so joyful with it. And they're wonderful, but can become a bit over noisy and a bit sort of primary school painting wall, or perhaps even sort of tub trugs in like an IKEA showroom or something, where it's just like, woo, busy, busy, busy. So you just have to be a bit careful with them. And the fourth palette is one that I'm particularly fond of at the moment. It is rather trendy at the moment, which is the soft and warm, which I call the cashmere jersey colours. And those are the apricots, the cafe au lait, so milky coffee, the soft peachy colours. And those are where they're predominantly white or pastel, but with a daub of the warm colours mixed in. So if you're a painter, it's just a little squeeze of mahogany or orange or yellow, golden yellow mixed in with the white. So they're the warmer tones, but very much of the pastel paler hues. And they are particularly lovely because they're very easy on the eye. They're really easy to work with. But the downside is that they can become sickly sweet, and it's a bit too much like eating peach sort of meringue or strawberry blancmange or strawberry mousse, and you actually need to cut it through with something. So I tend to use bronze, copper, and even into crimson to cut through the sort of almost soppiness of the soft and warm colours. So that takes me on to how to mix them, but perhaps first where to put them. So I've already mentioned the dark and rich we have here in the Oust Garden, and actually we have in the Dutch yard. And the only word of warning with those, if you love those colours, and by the way, the colour band that I'm including in each of these palettes will be in the podcast notes so you can see exactly what I'm going on about. But anyway, those, you just need to be a little bit careful not to put them in a dark place with dark foliage behind them, because they can create a bit of a black hole. And the second thing is they can be a little bit on the somber side. So choose them somewhere that's backlit or well lit, and don't put them near whites, because the contrast there is too strong and the white will dominate. Or actually, to be honest, really not many pale colours work well with that dark rich palette. The second one I've already mentioned where we put them, so out into the view. But of course, white and pale colours are fantastic in shady spots in the garden. So here, all the way along the north side of the barn and the school, we have a white border. And there, it doesn't get much sun at all, but it really creates its own light and it radiates out. And so we have things like the white foxglove, and then it's taken over, its sort of beaming capacity is taken over by Nicotiana sylvestris, which was one of the very rare annuals that thrives in shade. And it's related to the nightshade family, and it will really tolerate and grow well, even in quite deep shade. And then we have another lovely white-flowered plant called Acanthus Ledan. Most of the Acanthus family thrive in really hot, dry situations, but Ledan actually will struggle in the hot and dry and thrives in shade. And unlike its brother, doesn't get mildew, whatever the weather throws at it. So even in a dry summer, it's still very mildew resistant. Anyway, so white tulips and narcissi, and a white buddleia we have along there, and then these other white annuals, and of course the Japanese anemones. So that's the soft and cool. The soft and warm palette we use in the Dutch yard, and very much in spring we use surrounded by roses, so it's in the rose garden, because rose foliage, I'm sure you've noticed, is beautiful crimson and copper and bronze in the spring when it first emerges. And totally irrelevant to the colour of the flower, but in spring it's splendid with the soft, warm palette. It looks absolutely beautiful with, for instance, the sort of classic cafe au lait coloured tulip La Belle Epoque, but also I love it with apricot fox, which is double X on the fox, which is a very chalky orange, and that looks really, really beautiful. And then there's brownie and copper image. There are lots of these lovely sort of milky coffee coloured tulips. And so each of those, so the boiled sweet, there was a word of warning, but it's joyful. So remember, it's really good for getting the heart pumping. And so if you're walking between your door and your car and you just want to get into your car in a good mood, that's where to put the boiled sweet. The dark and rich, it fits almost anywhere as long as it's not too shady and too dark. And the pale and cool, the soft and cool, the crisp Parisian one is best into the view or in the shade. And then the soft and warm is very, very versatile. It will go almost anywhere, particularly looks lovely with rose foliage in the spring. So that's where to put them. And then how to mix them. And I've been thinking a lot about this recently because I've started work on my next new book, which is actually back to 30 years ago. I wrote the Cutting Garden book, and I've learnt so much about growing cut flowers, about how to condition them, but also how to combine them and how to combine colour since. And so I've written a huge amount about palettes in this next book, which won't be out actually till 2025 or even 6. But anyway, how to mix them. I think just a scattering of boiled sweet through the dark and rich really helps out and prevents it being too serious. And the counterbalance to that is a little bit of crimson, dark and rich, through the boiled sweet really helps to calm it down. And so we use a lot of the tulip named after me, Sarah Raven, through the boiled sweet palette here. And so the front cover of my pot book, which is just out this spring, is exactly that combination. So some real boiled sweet coloured tulips, but Sarah Raven is there to just bring a bit of sobriety and a bit of calm to the party. And then I really love using a little bit, as I mentioned, of bronze from the dark and rich through the soft and warm. That's always a really, really reliable mix. And then through whites, I use just the lightest dusting of a pink or a mauve or a sort of, soft blue. And that really makes the white whiter. And so I just have really good fun. I mean, this is my sort of final thing to say. How I work out whether a colour combination is working if I'm doing a party or an event is I'll pick the flowers and have them in my hand, and I will just shift them around to work out until I'm really, really happy with the palette. Or if I don't have flowers in front of me, so it's more hypothetical, I actually use either colour swatches from a paint shop, or if I'm lucky, I go and I have coloured candles in every colour that I can possibly find. And then I really, I move them around until I'm completely happy. And I find a coloured candle gives the same kind of sort of saturation and density of colour as you get from a flower. And so they work incredibly well. So just have a play, just play around with different tones and just work out what you think works best. But for me, colour is one of the absolute cornerstones of the garden here and of the way I garden. So I hope that isn't too much of a recap for some of you who've been listening for a while, but I hope that that's a bit of a refresh and an explanation for those who are new to listening to the podcast. Thanks very much for listening to Grow Cook Eat Arrange, and we will see you next week. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.